I scratched a $3 lottery ticket at a gas station on my way home from a 12-hour shift, and the numbers told me I had won $61 million. When I called to confirm, the woman on the other end of the line went very quiet. Then she said 4 words I have replayed in my head almost every day since. That's already been claimed. Good day, everyone. It's Vivian. I'm so glad you're here with me today. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe and leave me a comment letting me know which city you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. My name is Ruth Calloway. I was 52 years old when this happened, and I was working as a scheduling coordinator at a long-term care facility in Barrie, Ontario. The job paid reasonably well for what it was, which was mostly a polite way of saying it didn't pay well enough for what it actually required, which was being on call at all hours, managing staff shortages that never fully resolved themselves, and spending most of my working day talking people through problems that had no clean solutions. I had been doing it for 14 years. I am divorced. My daughter, Leanne, was 26 at the time and living in Hamilton with her partner. My son, Owen, was 22 and finishing a plumbing apprenticeship in Sudbury. I lived alone in a semi-detached house I'd bought out of the separation agreement 6 years earlier, in a quiet neighborhood where I knew my neighbors well enough to wave, and not much beyond that. My life was in the particular way of lives that have survived something difficult and settled into steadiness afterward, small and deliberate and mine. I did not buy lottery tickets often. Maybe 6 or 7 times a year, usually when the Lotto Max jackpot climbed high enough that it started appearing on the radio. That Thursday evening in February, I stopped at the Petro-Canada on Dunlop Street on my way home, bought a coffee and a bag of pretzels, and picked up a Lotto Max quick pick from the machine near the door. I wasn't thinking about it, not really. I was thinking about a scheduling conflict I hadn't finished resolving and whether I had anything worth eating at home. I tucked the ticket into the front pocket of my coat and forgot about it entirely. I found it the following Saturday morning while doing laundry. The ticket was still in my coat pocket, slightly creased. I set it on the kitchen counter and looked up the Friday night draw on my laptop while my coffee brewed, mostly out of habit rather than expectation. I read through the numbers once. Then I looked at the ticket. Then I read the numbers again, more slowly, because something had shifted in the center of my chest in a way I couldn't immediately account for. I checked the numbers 4 separate times. Each time the result was the same. All 7 main numbers matched. The bonus was irrelevant. According to the Lotto Max website, the jackpot for that draw had reached $61 million. My coffee finished brewing, and I did not drink it. I sat at the kitchen table and stayed very still for what I later estimated was close to 20 minutes, though I genuinely could not have told you that at the time. I kept looking for the mistake. Wrong draw date, wrong game. Numbers I'd misread in the wrong order. I checked everything I could think of checking. Nothing changed. I want to describe that moment honestly because I think people imagine it as purely joyful, and it wasn't. The first thing I felt was something close to vertigo. A sudden, total untethering from the ordinary shape of my morning. Then came something colder. A kind of vigilance I hadn't expected and couldn't entirely explain yet. I called the OLG player support line from the number listed on their official website. A recorded menu walked me through the options. I pressed the number for prize inquiries. After a short hold, a man answered. He was pleasant and professional, asked for my ticket serial number and the draw date, and I gave him both, reading them off carefully. There was a pause that lasted longer than it should have. "Ma'am," he said, and something in the careful way he shaped that word made me pay closer attention. I'm showing something irregular with this serial number. Can you hold for a moment while I transfer you to our verification team? I said yes. I held for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I counted. The woman who came on the line introduced herself as calling from OLG Lottery Security. She asked me to confirm my ticket details again, which I did. Then she said the 4 words I have not stopped thinking about since. That's already been claimed. I asked her to repeat herself. She did. Her voice was measured, professional, carefully neutral in the way voices get when someone has been trained to manage a difficult situation without revealing too much. I told her that wasn't possible, that I was holding the ticket in my hand right now, that I had purchased it myself Thursday evening at the Petro-Canada on Dunlop Street, and that no one else could have claimed it because I had not told another living person I'd bought it. She said she understood this was distressing, and that there appeared to be a discrepancy in their system that would require further investigation. She said I should not lose or damage the ticket, should not seek to media, and that someone from their investigations office would be in contact within 48 hours. She also told me, when I asked, that she was not able to give me a direct number to call back. That was the entirety of the conversation. I set the phone down on the table and looked at the ticket for a long time. Here is what I want to be clear about. I am not a person who panics easily. 14 years of managing care home scheduling, which is another way of saying 14 years of problems arriving faster than solutions, had given me a particular kind of steadiness under pressure. What I felt sitting at my kitchen table that morning was not panic. It was the specific, focused alertness of someone who has just been told something that cannot be true, delivered in a way that felt designed to make them doubt themselves. I had bought that ticket. I had the ticket. I had the receipt, time-stamped on my debit card statement. How exactly something that didn't yet exist 48 hours ago had already been claimed by someone else was a question I very much intended to have answered. The first thing I did was photograph the ticket from every angle with my phone, making sure to capture the serial number, the draw date, the retailer code printed along the bottom edge, and the timestamp. I emailed those photos to myself and to my cloud storage before doing anything else. The second thing I did was call Leanne. She listened without interrupting, which is not always her instinct, but which she managed this time. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mum, you need a lawyer before you call anyone else. Not the OLG, not anyone. A lawyer first." It was, almost exactly, what I had already started concluding on my own. Hearing her say it made it feel less like instinct and more like a decision. I spent the better part of Saturday afternoon searching for legal representation. Ontario has a small number of lawyers who specialize in gaming and lottery disputes, a category of law I had not known existed before that day, though it made a grim kind of sense that it would. I found a firm in Toronto with a partner named Douglas Firth, who had handled 2 prior OLG prize disputes, according to his firm's listed case history. I left a message that afternoon. He called back Sunday morning. Douglas Firth had a voice that managed to be both brisk and unhurried, which I found immediately reassuring. I described everything that had happened. He asked several precise questions. When I finished, he said, "Don't call OLG back. Don't go near that gas station, and write down everything from both phone calls tonight while the details are still clean. Word for word, as close as you can get." I met him at his Toronto office Monday, having arranged coverage at work with a vague reference to a family matter I needed to handle in person. His office was practical and slightly cluttered in the way of offices where real work gets done. He looked at the ticket photographs for a long time under a desk light, cross-referencing the serial number format against what he could pull up on his screen. "The ticket looks legitimate," he said, "consistent with a valid quick pick issued from that retailer's terminal for that draw. The retailer code matches the Petro-Canada location you described." He looked up, which makes the already been claimed response you received very unusual. Standard procedure when a ticket status is disputed or flagged is to open a formal investigation file and give the claimant a reference number, not to tell them the prize has already been claimed without any documentation or case number provided. I asked him what he thought had actually happened. He was careful with his answer. There are two realistic possibilities. One, there is a genuine processing error in OLG's system, and we're dealing with administrative confusion rather than anything intentional. Two, someone involved with that retailer terminal had information about that ticket and took steps to claim it before you could. He paused. Given the specific phrasing you received, I lean toward the second. Already been claimed is not language that comes from a system glitch. That's a status that requires someone to have submitted a claim. I thought about the Petro-Canada on Dunlop. I tried to think about who had been working the counter that Thursday evening. There had been a woman I'd seen behind that register before, not often, maybe 3 or 4 times over the years. 50s, short, dark hair. I didn't know her name. There had also been a younger man I didn't recognize restocking something near the coolers. I had been tired after a long shift and not paying particular attention to either of them. Douglas filed a formal dispute with OLG's Prize Validation Center that same afternoon, attaching the time-stamped photographs, my debit card transaction record confirming the purchase, and a formal request for the complete claim documentation associated with the disputed serial number, including the identity of whoever had submitted a prior claim and when. He also requested the retailer terminal transaction log for the 48 hours surrounding the draw. It took OLG's investigations and security branch 4 business days to respond. When they did, the tone was markedly different from the initial call. The investigator assigned to my file, a man named Investigator Paul Renault from OLG Security, called Douglas directly and spoke in the way people speak when something has already alarmed them before the conversation started. Douglas told me afterward that Renault had asked, within the first 2 minutes, whether I had spoken to any journalists. He said it the same way Director Schumacher had asked Renata in the video about media contact, which was the sign of an organization already managing something they understood to be serious. The terminal logs told a story I had not anticipated. On the Friday morning after the draw, before I had found the ticket in my coat pocket, and before I had called anyone, a prize claim had been initiated at an OLG prize center in Barrie, using a ticket with my serial number. The claim had been submitted in person, with a physical ticket, by a woman named Gwendolyn Mercer, who identified herself as the purchaser. The claim had been flagged automatically because the serial number had also triggered a duplicate ticket alert in the system. A fail-safe OLG systems had built in after a fraud case several years earlier. The flag had not stopped the claim from being processed because the alert required human review to action, and the person reviewing the queue that morning had cleared it without escalating. Gwendolyn Mercer's name meant nothing to me, but her employer did. She had listed her employer on the prize claim form as required by OLG policy. She worked at the Petro-Canada on Dunlop Street. Douglas relayed this to me in his office, his voice steady and precise in the way he had of delivering information that required space to absorb. Ruth, someone who works at the retailer where you purchased the ticket, submitted a claim on that serial number the morning after the draw, before you had contacted OLG at all. That means she either had access to your ticket's information before you called, or she had a duplicate ticket produced from the same terminal. I sat with that for a moment. Is that possible? I asked. Producing a duplicate? OLG terminals don't allow exact reprints after a draw, but there is a type of fraud that has occurred before in Canada, where a retailer scans a customer's ticket under the guise of checking if it's a winner, then substitutes it with a worthless ticket and keeps the original. It's the oldest version of this scam. If she scanned your ticket through the machine at the counter and swapped it before returning what she handed back to you, you might not have noticed, especially if the physical tickets were similar in appearance. I thought back to Thursday evening. I had been tired. I had bought the ticket from the machine myself, not through the counter, but I had set it down on the counter while paying for the coffee and the pretzels. A brief window. Long enough. Something cold and very clear settled into the center of my chest. So the ticket I've been holding, I said, might be a blank. It might be a voided or worthless ticket from the same machine, yes, Douglas said, which is why the serial number comparison between your ticket and the one submitted in the claim is the critical piece. I've formally requested OLG conduct a full forensic comparison. OLG's response came 3 days later. The forensic comparison confirmed that the ticket I held had been issued from the same terminal during the same transaction window as the winning ticket, but had not matched the winning draw. Gwendolyn Mercer had submitted the ticket with the winning serial number. It was, in its quiet way, confirmation of exactly what Douglas had suggested. I had been handed back a different ticket. OLG Security opened a formal fraud investigation, and the RCMP's commercial crime section was notified given the dollar amount involved. The prize funds were placed on administrative hold pending the outcome of the investigation, which meant no one was going to receive $61 million while the matter was unresolved. Gwendolyn Mercer was contacted by investigators and suspended from her position by the franchise owner within the same week. What I had not expected was that she would call me. I did not know she had my phone number until she used it. On a Tuesday evening 11 days after the investigation had officially opened. A number I didn't recognize. I answered because I had been answering unknown numbers since this began, on the understanding that ignoring things in this situation was not a strategy that served me. Miss Calloway, she said, and her voice had the particular texture of someone who has been awake for too long. I think we should speak before this gets much further along. I said nothing immediately. I know how this looks, she continued. But I want you to understand something. I have worked that counter for 9 years. 9 years. I have watched people come in and buy quick picks with their grocery money and walk out laughing about losing $20, and I have smiled and said, "Have a good night." 9 years, and I have never taken anything that wasn't mine. Not once. A pause. That Friday morning, I found the ticket on the floor behind the counter, near the lottery terminal. I thought someone had dropped it. I checked it because that's part of the job. When I saw the numbers, I genuinely thought, someone had abandoned it. I waited for a moment before I answered. Then why didn't you turn it in as lost property and let OLG sort out who it belonged to? The silence on her end stretched too long to be natural. Gwendolyn, I said, I bought that ticket. I have the debit record, my card, my PIN, my transaction. That ticket did not end up on the floor behind your counter by accident. I'm not asking you to say I'm innocent, she said, and her voice had changed registers now, moved from apologetic into something more careful. I'm asking whether there's a way through this that doesn't end in a criminal charge. I have a mother in a care home. My name is the only income in this household. If the RCMP lays charges, I lose everything. And you're about to receive $61 million. There it was. What I'm about to receive, I said, keeping my voice level, is money that was taken from me by someone who made a decision about what my property was worth compared to what she thought she could get away with. I understand you're frightened. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But what you're describing isn't a conversation I'm able to have without my lawyer present. I'm not threatening you. She said it quickly, as if anticipating that I might take it that way. I know, I said, but I'm still going to hang up now, and I'm going to call Douglas Firth tonight and tell him exactly what you said. I did. Douglas told me to write it down in full before I slept and to send it to him by morning. He also said, calmly, that an unsolicited approach to a prize claimant during an active fraud investigation was itself a significant issue that he intended to raise with investigator Renaud. He did. Renaud confirmed it the following day. He also confirmed something else he had not been able to tell us before the investigation had formally progressed to that stage. Gwendolyn Mercer had done this before. 3 years earlier, at a different location in the same franchise network, a scratched ticket worth $4,800 had been claimed under circumstances that investigators had flagged at the time, but ultimately closed without charges when the original purchaser, an elderly man named Theodore Wills, who had paid cash and had no transaction record, could not establish proof of purchase. The amount had been too small to justify the investigative resources required. The file had been closed. The pattern changed everything. What had been framed tentatively as a possible misunderstanding or a poor decision under pressure, a woman who found a ticket and made a terrible choice, became something else entirely when laid against that earlier case. A method, a practice, someone who had identified the specific vulnerability in cash transactions where no card record existed and exploited it at least twice. Douglas described the shift in the RCMP's posture as immediate. The charges expanded from fraud to include a breach of trust designation, given her position as a lottery retailer, and the earlier Wills case was formally reopened. I had not planned to contact Theodore Wills. I didn't know anything about him beyond the name Investigator Renaud, mentioned almost in passing. But Douglas, who had begun to understand me fairly well by that point, anticipated the question before I asked it, and made a quiet inquiry through appropriate channels about whether the original investigator's file had enough to identify him. It did. Theodore Wills was 78 years old and lived in a senior's residence in Collingwood. When Renaud's office called him to explain what they'd found, he reportedly sat quietly for a long time before he said anything. I heard this secondhand, through Douglas, but the image of it stayed with me. A man who had assumed for 3 years that he'd simply read his scratch ticket wrong. A week before the RCMP formally laid charges, I received a call from someone identifying himself as a friend of the family, asking whether I might consider speaking with the Crown about Gwendolyn's circumstances. Her mother's health, her clean record prior to these 2 incidents. He spoke the way people speak when they've been asked to make a call they find uncomfortable but feel they owe someone. Rehearsed, apologetic, quick. I told him politely that I wasn't in a position to advocate either way, and that anything related to the criminal proceedings needed to go through the appropriate legal process. He thanked me and hung up. I told Douglas the same day. He said it was a softer approach than the direct call Gwendolyn had made, but the same request wearing different clothes. He had begun to suspect, he said, that Gwendolyn's immediate family were the ones managing her legal strategy from the outside. Now that she'd been told not to contact me again, the RCMP laid charges on a Thursday morning in April, fraud over $5,000, breach of trust. A related charge concerning the Wills case, once the reopened file had produced enough to proceed. Leanne drove up from Hamilton the day before the charges were announced and stayed with me for the weekend. Owen called from Sudbury and offered to drive down too, and I told him to save the gas, that I had his sister, and that was enough. He said he'd drive down anyway. He did. We spent that Friday evening doing something I had not permitted myself since the Saturday morning in February, when I'd found the ticket in my coat pocket. We made dinner together in my kitchen, the three of us, a big pot of soup from a recipe that had been my mother's and before that my grandmother's, and we ate it at the kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with lottery terminals or fraud investigators or administrative holds. Owen had a new story about his apprenticeship supervisor that made Leanne laugh until she spilled her water. I sat there watching both of them and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized had been braced for weeks. I slept properly that night for the first time since February. The preliminary hearing was held in Barrie Provincial Court, a plain building on Worsley Street that I had driven past hundreds of times without once imagining I'd be inside it. I arrived with Douglas. Owen and Leanne sat in the gallery behind me. A colleague from the care facility, a woman named Joanne, had called the morning before to say she'd seen the local news report and to ask if she could sit with us. I said yes and was more grateful for it than I'd expected. I gave my testimony plainly and in order. I described the Thursday evening purchase, the Saturday morning discovery, the phone calls, the photographs I'd taken. I described the call from Gwendolyn. I had notes with me, written the night of each event, and I offered to have them compared to my testimony. The defense did not pursue that line. The Crown's presentation of the terminal logs was precise and methodical. The timestamp placing Gwendolyn's claim at the OLG Prize Center in Barrie less than 18 hours after the draw. The duplicate serial number alert that had been cleared without escalation. The forensic comparison confirming that the ticket I'd held was from the same terminal, but not the winning ticket. And then the Wills case. The earlier incident that transformed the narrative from a single bad decision into evidence of a method. The courtroom went noticeably quiet when that information was introduced. Gwendolyn's composure, which had been careful and contained through most of the morning, shifted when the Wills details were entered into the record. She leaned toward her counsel and said something low and urgent. Her lawyer's expression changed. It was the look of someone recalculating the architecture of a defense built on circumstances that no longer fully applied. The judge asked the Crown directly whether the earlier Wills case would be treated as a separate proceeding or folded into the current file. At this stage, Your Honor, we are treating it as pattern evidence in the present case. A separate related charge will proceed in parallel. There was a recess. It lasted close to an hour. When the court reconvened, Gwendolyn's counsel indicated that his client wished to enter a guilty plea on the primary fraud charge. The judge, before accepting the plea, addressed Gwendolyn directly. She noted, for the record, that the evidence before the court suggested this was not an isolated lapse, but a practice applied with deliberate awareness, of which transactions were most difficult to trace. She noted that Theodore Wills, who was 78 years old and had not known for 3 years that anything other than bad luck had happened to him, would now have to go through the process of having his experience reopened. She said this with an evenness that was more pointed than any visible emotion would have been. I watched Gwendolyn's face during that part. The person sitting at the defense table was much smaller than the voice that had called me on a Tuesday night and asked whether there was a way through this. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I felt something more complicated, the particular weight of a situation in which the outcome was correct and still left things behind it that couldn't be fully cleaned up. Douglas had warned me to expect that. He'd said, in our very first meeting, that cases like this rarely resolve in ways that feel entirely finished, because the facts that led to them don't disappear when the verdict does. Under the terms of the plea, Gwendolyn received a sentence of 20 months, with restitution ordered. Her lottery retail license was permanently revoked, and the franchise owner was placed on notice by OLG regarding retailer screening practices. The related Wills charge, proceeding separately, would carry its own resolution, likely including restitution to Theodore Wills of the original $4,800, and whatever the court assessed in penalties beyond that. The administrative hold on my prize was lifted the following week. The actual claims process, when it began in earnest, was more paperwork than I had imagined. Douglas walked me through each stage with his characteristic efficiency. The verification, the tax documentation, the formal declaration of win. At one point, I joked to him that I had processed more signatures in the previous 2 weeks than I had in 14 years of scheduling manifests, and he said, without quite smiling, that, in his experience, lottery claimants were unprepared for the administrative dimension of winning $61 million, which was something he felt could stand to be communicated more broadly. I chose the lump sum after conversations with Douglas and with a financial planner he recommended, a careful, methodical man named Gordon Abe, who specialized in what he called sudden wealth management, which he explained to me in our first meeting with the same patient precision he applied to everything. After federal and provincial taxes, which Douglas had made sure I understood in detail before I made any decisions, the amount settled at a little over $28 million. I sat in Gordon's office the afternoon. That number was finalized and felt the thing I had been waiting to feel since February. And it was not what I had expected. It was not euphoria. It was a very quiet, very specific sense of relief. The particular relief of something that nearly went entirely wrong, instead landing exactly where it was supposed to. I called no one immediately. I drove partway home, pulled into a Tim Hortons parking lot on the edge of Barrie, ordered a medium coffee at the drive-thru, and sat in the lot for about 15 minutes, letting it be real before I had to talk to anyone about it. It seemed important to have that time. I don't entirely know why, but I didn't question it. I gave notice at the care facility, though not right away and not abruptly. I worked another month, trained the person who would be taking over my scheduling responsibilities, made sure every file was in order. On my last day, my team had quietly put together a small card that everyone on staff had signed, including several residents who had heard I was leaving and asked to be included. One of them, a woman in her 80s who had been a resident for 4 years and who I had spent a lot of early mornings chatting with during her first cup of tea, had written inside the card in careful cursive, "You always showed up. That matters more than you know." I stood in the break room and cried in a way I hadn't permitted myself in months, which my coworkers bore with great patience and good humor. I bought a house, not extravagant, a detached century home with high ceilings and a proper garden on a quiet street in Barrie, the kind of house I had walked past for years and allowed myself to look at for exactly as long as it took to remember that it was not the kind of thing that applied to me. It applied to me now. I helped Owen with a down payment on a place in Sudbury. He resisted at first, the way people do when they've been raised to be careful about accepting things, and I told him that I had also been raised to be careful and that being careful did not mean refusing what was genuinely offered by someone who genuinely wanted to give it. He accepted. He called me from the closing meeting, and his voice sounded the way his voice had sounded when he was small, and something had gone better than expected. I paid down Leanne's student debt in full, which she had been quietly managing for 5 years without complaining about it in front of me, which I had always known and never said anything about. She called me immediately and said I absolutely did not have to do that. I said I was aware of that. There was a pause, and then she said, very quietly, "Thank you, Mum." That was enough. I set up a trust for both of them, structured carefully with Gordon's guidance so the money would support them without becoming something they built their expectations around. And I did one other thing that surprised me when I thought of it, which was to contact the OLG's Retailer Accountability Office and offer to fund, anonymously, a support resource specifically for prize claimants who could not afford legal representation in disputed cases, the kind of case that involved amounts too small to attract experienced gaming lawyers, the sort of amounts that had let Gwendolyn walk away from what she did to Theodore Wills 3 years earlier because he had no way to fight it. OLG's legal team required some time to determine the right administrative structure for accepting such a fund. Douglas handled the details. It took several months to establish properly, but eventually it did. I heard, through Douglas's informal contact with the Crown's office, after the Wills proceeding concluded, that Theodore Wills had received full restitution plus a supplemental award from the court. Someone at Renaud's office had passed along, through appropriate channels, that he had asked whether the person whose case had reopened his could be identified. Douglas asked me whether I wanted to be. I said yes. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon. He had a quiet, careful voice, the kind that sounds as if it has learned patience from long experience. He didn't ask me for anything. He said he had spent 3 years believing that he had simply been unlucky, that he must have misread the numbers in the excitement of thinking he'd won, the way old eyes sometimes play tricks. He had made peace with it, the way you make peace with things that can't be changed, and then the call from the investigator had come. I kept the ticket, he told me, in a drawer in my room. I didn't know why. I just couldn't throw it away. I didn't say anything for a moment. I think some part of you knew, I said finally, even if the rest of you had accepted the other explanation. He was quiet on his end. Then he said, "I'm going to throw it away tonight." We talked for another 40 minutes, mostly about small things. His garden, which he maintained with whatever space the residents allowed him. Leanne's upcoming move to a slightly bigger apartment in Hamilton, the particular way February in Ontario never quite prepares you for March. When we hung up, I sat in my new kitchen with its high ceilings and the late afternoon light coming through the garden window and felt, for the first time since I'd found that ticket in my coat pocket on a Saturday morning in February, that the whole thing was genuinely finished. Not because Gwendolyn had been sentenced, and not because my account had been settled, but because the man in the drawer in his room could finally let go of the thing he'd been keeping without entirely knowing why. A few months after the sentencing, a local reporter who had followed the case reached out through Douglas's office, requesting a brief statement. I said that I had tried at every step to do what was straightforwardly correct, that the investigation had worked the way investigations are supposed to work, and that I hoped the outcome of the Wills case, specifically, would be noticed by anyone responsible for the threshold at which disputed claims get investigated. Douglas sent the statement on my behalf. The reporter wrote something fair and reasonably accurate. The months that followed had a quality I hadn't anticipated, which was ordinariness, not emptiness, but the particular piece of a life that has what it needs and isn't braced against itself anymore. I gardened more than I had in years. I drove down to Hamilton to see Leanne and her partner, and we spent a weekend walking along the waterfront doing absolutely nothing of consequence, which was everything. I went to Sudbury and helped Owen paint the second bedroom of his new place a color he'd chosen himself that I privately thought was a bit bold, and kept that opinion to myself, and it looked fine in the end. I thought sometimes about what Douglas had said in our very first conversation, that the ticket looked legitimate, the retailer code matched, and the response I had received was very unusual. That careful, methodical assessment delivered by a man who had not yet had any reason to be confident about the outcome. I thought about how close the whole thing had come to being something I never knew. If I hadn't photographed the ticket before I called OLG, if I'd accepted the already been claimed and set it aside as some kind of mistake, if OLG's duplicate ticket alert had never been built into their system after whatever earlier case had prompted it. I did not dwell on this with anxiety. I dwelled on it with something closer to recognition, that the careful, unremarkable things, the documentation, the photographs, the unwillingness to accept a conclusion that didn't make sense, had mattered more than anything else. A $3 ticket. 4 words that were designed to make me give up before I started. That's already been claimed. Here is what I learned. When something doesn't add up, it's because something doesn't add up. Photograph everything. Find the right person to help you, and trust their expertise enough to follow it. And don't let someone else's confidence talk you out of what you know to be true. I didn't win because I was luckier than Gwendolyn Mercer expected me to be. I won because I refused to accept an answer that required me to stop asking questions. So if you're ever sitting at a kitchen table on a Saturday morning with a coffee going cold and a number that looks impossible, don't hang up. Don't walk away. Get the receipt, take the photograph, and find Douglas Firth, or someone very much like him.